Chapter 5. April 10th, 1792. The weather was now again most delicious and revived our spirits exceedingly. The sun began to have power and the river was quite free of ice. So the Indians assured us for 100 miles ahead. We bade adieu to the Little Snake, a chief of the Rickaries who had shown the voyagers many evidences of friendship during the winter, and his band with unfeigned regret, and set out after breakfast on our voyage. Perrine, an agent of the Hudson Bay Fur Company on his way to Petit Côte, accompanied us with 3 Indians for the first 10 miles. When he took leave of us and made his way back to the village, where, as we afterwards heard, he had met with a violent death from the hands of the squaw, to whom he offered some insult. Upon parting with the agent, we pushed on vigorously up the river and made great way, notwithstanding a rapid current. In the afternoon, Thornton, who had been complaining for some days past, was taken seriously ill, so much that I urged the return of the whole party to the hut, there to wait until he should get better. But he resisted this offer so strongly that I was forced to yield. We made him a comfortable bed in the cabin and paid him every attention. But he had a raging fever and with occasional delirium, and I was much afraid that we should lose him. In the meantime, we still pushed ahead with resolution, and by night we had made 20 miles. An excellent day's work. April 11th. Still beautiful weather. We started early and had a good wind, which aided us greatly, so that but for Thornton's illness, we should have all been in fine spirits. He seemed to grow much worse, and I scarcely knew how to act. Everything was done for his comfort, which could be done. Jules, the Canadian, made him some tea from prairie herbs, which had the effect of inducing perspiration and allayed the fever very sensibly. We stopped at night on the mainland to the north, and 3 hunters went out into the prairie by moonlight, returning at 1 in the morning without their rifles and with a fat antelope. They related that, having proceeded many miles across the country, they reached the banks of the beautiful rivulet. Where they were much surprised and alarmed at discovering a large war party at the Seonee Sioux, who immediately took them prisoners and carried them a mile on the other side of the stream to a kind of park or enclosure walled with mud and sticks, in which was a large herd of antelopes. These animals were still coming into the park, the gates of which were so contrived as to prevent escape. There was an annual practice of the Indians. In the autumn, the antelopes retired for food and shelter from the prairie to the mountains regions up on the south of the river. In the spring, they would cross in great numbers and they're easily taken by being enticed into a strong enclosure as above described. The hunters, John Greeley, the prophet, and a Canadian, had scarcely any hope of escape from the clutches of the Indians, who numbered as many as 50, and had well nigh made up their minds to die. Greeley and the prophet were disarmed and tied hand and foot. The Canadian, however, was suffered, for some reason not perfectly understood, to remain unbound, and was only deprived of his rifle, the savages leaving him in the possession of his hunter's knife, which possibly they did not perceive, as it was worn in a sort of sheath in the side of his legging, and treating him otherwise with a marked difference from their demeanor to the others. This circumstance proved it to the source of the party's deliverance. It was perhaps 9 o'clock at night when they first were taken. The moon was bright, but as the air was unusually cool for the season, the savages had kindled up 2 large fires at the sufficient distance from the park not to frighten the antelopes, who were still pouring into it continually. At these fires they were occupied in cooking their game when the hunters so unexpectedly came upon them from around a clump of trees. Greeley and the Prophet, after being disarmed and bound with strong thongs of buffalo hide, were thrown down under a tree at some distance from the blaze, while a Canadian was permitted to seat himself in charge of two savages by one of the fires, the rest of the Indians forming a circle around the other and larger one. In this arrangement, the time wore away slowly, and the hunters were in momentary expectation of death. The cords of the two were bound caused them also infinite pain from the tightness with which they were fastened. The Canadian had endeavored to hold a conversation with his guards in the hope of bribing them to release him, but could not make himself understood. About midnight, the congregation around the large fire were suddenly disturbed by the dash of several large antelopes in succession through the midst of the blaze. These animals had burst through a portion of the mud wall which had confined them, and mad with rage and affright had made for the light of the fire, as is the habit of insects at night in like circumstances. It seems, however, that the Sayonis had never heard of any similar feat of these usually timid creatures, for they were in great terror at the unexpected interruption, and their alarm increased to perfect dismay. As the whole captured herd came rushing and bounding upon them, after the lapse of a minute or so from the outbreak of the first few. The hunters described the scene as one of the most singular in nature. The beasts were apparently frantic in the velocity and impetuosity with which they flew rather than leaped through the flames, and through the midst of the terrified savages, which said by Greeley, a man not in the least prone to exaggerate, to have been not only an imposing but even a terrible spectacle. They carried before them in their first plunges, but having cleared the large fire, they immediately dashed at the small one, scattering the brands and blazing wood about, and then returned, as if bewildered, to the large one. And so backwards and forwards until they climbed the fires, and when in small parties, they scampered off like lightning to the woods. Many of the Indians were knocked down in this furious melee, and there was no doubt that some of them were seriously, if not mortally, wounded by the sharp hooves of the agile antelopes. Some threw themselves flat on the ground and so avoided injury. The Prophet and Greeley, not being near the fires, were in no danger. The Canadian was prostrated at the first onset by a kick which rendered him senseless for some minutes. When he came to himself, he was nearly in darkness, for the moon had gone behind a heavy thundercloud, and the fires were almost out, or only existed in brands scattered hither and thither. He saw no Indians near him, and instantly arousing himself to escape, made, as well as he could, for the tree where his two comrades were lying. Their thongs were soon out, cut, and the three set off at full speed in the direction of the river without stopping to think of their rifles or of anything beyond present security. Having run for some miles and finding no one in pursuit, they slackened their pace and made their way to a spring for a draught of water. Here it is they were met with the antelope which, as I mentioned before, they brought with them to the boats. The poor creature lay panting and unable to move by the border of the spring. One of its legs were broken, and it bore evidence of traces of fire. It was no doubt one of the herd which had been means of deliverance. Had there been even a chance of its recovery, the hunters would have spared it in token of their gratitude, but it was miserably injured, and so they put it out at once out of its misery, and brought it home to the boats, where we made an excellent breakfast upon it the next morning. April 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th. During these 4 days we kept on our course without any adventure of note. The weather was very pleasant during the middle of the day, but the nights and mornings were exceedingly cold, and we had sharp frosts. Game was abundant. Thorson still continued ill, and his sickness perplexed and grieved me beyond measure. I missed his society very much, and now found that he was almost the only member of our party in whom I could strictly confide. By this I merely mean that he was almost the only one whom I could or would freely unburthen my heart, with all its wild hopes and fantastic wishes. Not that any individual among us was unworthy of implicit faith. On the contrary, we were all like brothers, and a dispute of any importance never occurred. One interest seemed to bind us all, or rather, we appeared to be abandoned voyagers without interest in view, mere travelers for pleasure. What ideas the Canadians might have held upon the subject I cannot indeed exactly say. The fellows talked a great deal, to be sure, about the profits of the enterprise, and especially about their expected share of it. Yet I can scarcely think that they cared much for these points, for they were almost simple-minded, and certainly the most obliged set of beings upon the face of the earth. As for the rest of the crew, I had no doubt in the world that the pecuniary benefit to be afforded by such an expedition was the last thing upon which they speculated. Some singular evidences of the feeling, which more or less pervaded us all, occurred during the prosecution of the voyage. Interests which in the settlements would have looked upon us as of the highest importance were here treated as matters unworthy of a serious word, and neglected, or rather totally discarded upon the most frivolous pretext. Men who traveled thousands of miles through a howling wilderness, beset by horrible dangers, and endured the most heart-rending privations of the most ostensible purpose of collecting peltries, would seldom take the trouble to secure them when obtained, and would leave behind them without a sigh the entire cachet of fine beaver skins, rather than forego the pleasure of pushing up some romantic-looking river, or penetrating into some craggy and dangerous cavern, for materials whose use they knew nothing about, and which they threw aside as lumber at the first decent opportunity. In all this, my own heart was very much with the rest of the party, and I am free to say that as we proceeded in our journey, I found myself less and less interested in the main business of the expedition, and more willing to turn aside in pursuit of idle amusement, if indeed I am right in calling by so feeble a name, as amusement that deep and intense excitement with which I surveyed the wonders and majestic beauties of the wilderness. No sooner had I examined one region than I was possessed with an irresistible desire to push forward and explore another. As yet, however, I felt as if in too close proximity to the settlements for full enjoyment of my burning love of nature and of the unknown. I cannot help but be aware that some civilized footsteps, although few, had preceded me in my journey, that some eyes before my own had been enraptured with the scenes around me. But for the sentiment ever obtruding itself, I should no doubt have loitered more frequently on the way, turning aside to survey the features of the region bordering upon the river, and perhaps penetrating deeply at times into the heart of the country to the north and south of our route. But I was anxious to go on, to get, if possible, beyond the extreme bounds of civilization, to gaze, if I could, upon those gigantic mountains, of which the existence had been made known to us only by the vague accounts of the Indians. These ulterior hopes and views I communicated fully to no one of our party save Thornton. He participated in my most visionary projects and entered most completely into the spirit of romantic enterprise which pervaded my soul. I therefore felt his illness as a bitter evil. He grew worse daily, while it was out of our power to render him any effectual assistance. April 16th. Today we had a cold rain with a high wind from the north, obliging us to come and anchor until late in the afternoon. At 4 o'clock p.m. we proceeded and made 5 miles by night. Thornton was much worse.